just to try to frame the context of this conversation a little bit. And before I get to that, and I think with the presence of Patrik here, and I think we did this, I'm not so sure if we did it in a public forum. I know we did it in the web, and we do it in the magazine and so on, but I just wanted to take 1 second to remind all of us how come that we met Patrik, and that was because Zaha Hadid, and still everything is too fresh, and the pain still is deep. But I just wanted to mention that part because, as I mentioned, she was a good friend, and she was an extraordinary architect and many, many other things. But among other things, she was always interested in debate and exchange of ideas. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's important to remember all the time the good people with the good causes and the good architects and everything in between. So to get to why we are here, we thought being summer, starting the summer semester, which is always a little bit more relaxed, that we should start with a very heavy-duty conversation just to get everybody in the mood for the summer term. This was supposed to happen in the spring. We couldn't get the date works, then we decided to move to the fall. But Patrik was in town, and we decided that why not do it today. And so here, Patrik Schumacher and Tom Wiscombe to be part of a series that we started last year called Duel and Duet. At the end of the day, or at the end, the idea is at the end of this conversation, it's up to you to figure out the conclusion what this was. In this particular case, it's a strange one because I think this is a lot like a Thanksgiving or a Christmas. It's when family arguing with each other. This is I don't think this is an argument within the family. I want to be very, very clear, and I will say that most of these duels and duets are within the family. I really think sometimes in some of these heated or some of them less heated debates, we tend to forget that whoever is the enemy or the adversary is not in here, it's out there. And it's out there in many forms and shapes, and they're way more powerful than anything that we can construct. So it's important to remember that any of these disagreements, it come from the passion and the desire to prove what are the better mechanisms to go around to keep evolving the discipline and the profession that we all love and care. So, but to give a little bit more light, I was thinking that the theme this summer with Blockbuster seems to be people who tend to be on the same side, to be fighting. And nobody knows, particularly in Batman vs. Superman, I don't know if you saw it, it's a bad movie. And at the end of the day, you don't know why they were fighting at the beginning, because basically they were dealing about mommy issues. And they would think, why would it take 2 minutes to talk for 5 minutes? And they will realize, and they realize at the end that they're on the same side. So the same with Iron Man and Captain America, and you have to pick a side. It seems kind of a ridiculous thing. I mean, they're all on the same side, but they are all arguing about how to go around, in this case, how to be a superhero or to be good. And this is an important conversation, jokes aside, because it has to do a lot with what are the mechanisms, and I want to pick up on something that we recently discussed in New Haven about the problem of authority and I would say authority plus authorship. There is a conversation today, which I think is, for me, is the most scary one, and I'm not talking about Donald Trump or any of that. I'm talking about the scary one that's going on in the conversation of architecture, which is this desire and this push that has become the current trend, or almost architecture without architects, or design without designers, and to replace with a very faulty and empty social agenda that doesn't amount to anything, like if architecture with capital A is not capable of doing that. So there is something really peculiar about that conversation and that discussion, and I think both Tom and Patrik represent a very sophisticated way to oppose to that oversimplification, and I would say, to be fair, over a stupidization of the argument, what is the role of architecture? And I think this is an important debate to have. No, that doesn't mean that society or people don't have nothing to say, or they're not important in conversation, but the idea that the architecture is something that can exist as a secondary thing that is not part of the center of the conversation is preposterous. And I think both of them, Tom and Patrick, represents extraordinary ways to keep revitalizing and how to engage in this conversation. There is also like a relaxed side in which both of them and the other, the last duel at Duet, Pinky and the Brain, want to take over the world, the other want to ruin it. So there is something about that in the conversation as well. So it has to have this little bit of megalomania quality. Any architect has this kind of idiosyncratic, quasi-individualistic way to see the world, and I will argue that, once again, Patrick and Tom are really good representative of that. But as I said at the beginning, at the end of the day, and this picture cannot be even better, at the end of the day, I have the feeling that they're going to have to argue a little bit to make an entertaining, like in Batman and Superman. But at the end of the road, I think we're all going to come to the conclusion that we're all fighting from the same side, and that the villains and the super bad people are somewhere else, and well, we need to figure it out, what are the best mechanisms to fight with them. So I think each of them is going to take turns to speak for like 15 minutes. I don't have any hope that they will oblige by those rules, certainly. So I hope that you don't have early dinner plans, and probably knowing and being in many Patrick conversations, at least until 10, we're going to keep going. So if you have any plans, call and move them. We'll do our best to keep it up to 9 o'clock. Who's going first? Patrick. So without further ado, Patrik Schumacher, a dear friend of SCI-Arc, welcome again.
Well, thanks a lot, first of all, Hernan, opening this school for me and giving me this platform on short notice, because I'm coming here to compete with Tom on a project on Sunset Boulevard. And I thought if I come here, I should definitely show up in SCI-Arc, and I love it already. I was in the show downstairs. It's spectacular. I mean, it's really thrilling to see all these models, hundreds of them, and intricate and dense and strong and full of vitality. So I think it's amazing. I'm already super stimulated about this. And is that working? Yeah, and I think the commitment to architecture and to design is very important, because that's not, we've got too many distractions from this core task of developing the repertoire and developing ideas, spaces, designs. And so that on that level is wonderful and stimulating. I don't think it's the right kind of design. And I will have a different idea of how we should develop our repertoire. But what I find really fascinating is the coherence down there. I mean, this amazing sense of discovering something different, and this radiates and ripples through the whole 100 models down there. I find that very, very striking. So I just want to briefly introduce a bit what I've trying to do now at this stage. I've just published this magazine, AD, which I've guest edited, called Parametric 2.0, and the idea here is precisely what the question was here. Isn't that movement dead, or is it falling apart? Is it receding? And I don't think it is. There has been some distractions we need to recognize and understand in the last few years. But the core group I've assembled here has kept deepening the discourse and tooled up further, and has developed a real urge and drive and capacity to go mainstream with this paradigm of architecture. And that's what I'm trying to argue for here. And that I've collected a lot of the key protagonists and some theorists into this. And I have the kind of starting architectural arguing about this impacting the global built environment. I mean, we have compared the 90s to the 1920s, and let's say if this movement picked up real momentum in the mid-90s, so 95, we're 20 years in, okay, we got the distraction in 2008 onwards, and if there isn't a lot of work, then there isn't that dynamic kind of fizzles. I mean, that's a problem, but modernism took the 1920s, and then you had fascism and the Second World War, and it kicked back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And I think we are at that stage once. I'm not sure if that crisis is overcome yet, but if there's a new dynamic coming forward, I think this paradigm could deliver. And I wanted to point out in this article that actually I'm not shy about commercial firms running with this. This is the Mumbai airport by SOM. There's also, in this article, I'm showing the Fuxas Shenzhen airport, our airport, Beijing airport is showing that this paradigm and style and set of values and techniques is delivering very large projects, and we're doing, infrastructure projects, urbanism projects, and some of these big Chinese projects. I mean, just what our firm has delivered is of a scale and across all continents of significance, which is maybe beyond what the 20s have delivered in modernism, but it's still a drop in the ocean with respect to the overall development of the built environment. Now I want to focus, if we go mainstream, we have to, of course, continue the investing in design sensibilities and further formal research, but there's been a lot of technological research, of course, pushed that paradigm forward. All the investment in computational intelligence, structural optimization techniques, environmental optimization, fabrication logics, all this is embedded and pushed further that paradigm. And we have started to build large projects, and we're addressing that's one of my topics. We need to argue for why this matters and means something, that it isn't looked at, that this work isn't a meaningless spectacle or an exuberant wastefulness of resources for no end but spectacle. No, these buildings which we can demonstrate are high performance urban districts or high performance projects for the corporate sector, for infrastructure projects, and that's very important to me. Residential complexes, mixed use complexes like this. This has nothing to do with spectacle. This is global best practice, high density urban order in major cities. These projects look the way they look because that's the way you can perform and have a complex space of communication, which that's why we all draw together into the city. And there's an urbanism article in this, I will talk later at the end a bit about how I see working further in more detailed ways on what I call the social functionality of the built environment, and why parametricism is the most sophisticated and compelling and high performance social functionality approach. There's an urbanism approach to this, and this mentality of bringing, having a new era of urban concentration. What that does, it creates this kind of cityscapes which are vital but also at the same time chaotic and undigestible. And how can we think of a market-driven and market-based urban order as what I'm trying to argue through this article, and I'm saying that a hegemonic parametricism is able to deliver urban identity and path-dependent build-up of identities, unique identities, unpredictable identities in a bottom-up process which doesn't require central planning, which I take out of the equation because I don't believe that London, if you look at it, is a function of planning. You cannot imagine that anybody has planned that. This is just raw agglomeration where planners try to do stuff but are overrun in a sense by the urbanization process. But I believe that this market-driven urbanization will continue, but nevertheless it doesn't necessarily in contradiction with an urban order. Now I want to show a few of those protagonists I put into the magazine and show what this does. It's a much more mature and sophisticated stage of parametrism, because when in the earlier days we were having single systems, NURB surfaces, blobs, etc. And that had a lot of degrees of freedom and variety in terms of shape making, and you could push and pull a figure into complex urban conditions. You could have a lot of porosity and feel like continuous changefulness, but nevertheless it was just always NURBS, NURBS, NURBS. And what you get when you discipline and constrain this paradigm with particular material logics, structural logics, environmental logics, fabrication logics, you get a much greater variety. Not only have you working with technologies which give you a sense of lightness and technical advantages, you get this much richer variety of architectural forms of expression where each project, each room could have a more unique identity and recognizability. And that for me is very important, because when I talk about the formal diversity which we're generating, I want to instrumentalize this for what I in the end will describe as a semiological project. I want to have the built environment as a system of signification which orients and expresses and codes the diversity of social institutions which are agglomerating in the city. So this was Achim Menge's project. This is Mark Fawn's. So what is interesting about these projects, that they are following a very, very rigorous set of principles coming out of fabrication technology and structure, and here particular ways of embedding three-dimensional form in a pattern 2D tiling systems, and you get a lot of character, a lot of identity, a lot of richness, and this is really like the endless form of nature, much more than what you could have invented when you look at an empty sheet of paper and you're trying to come up with forms. These are engines of invention for me, and they have the additional advantage that they're already pre-constrained with certain constructability logics of lightness, logics of economy, because you can just laser cut these things. So there's a kind of serendipitous, or it is sought out in the end when you start selecting this coincidence of two very different sets of criteria. Feasibility style criteria coming out of an engineering set of logics, and let's say this, you could call it artistic repertoire expansion, but even that doesn't remain artistic. That becomes a repertoire of a new grammar and language of articulating social societal diversity in a field which becomes much more navigable and legible. So these are the features I want to emphasize, and you can also work directly with graphics and a semiological condition. For instance, this is just patches of black color, and you can create space and make phenomenal space and generate a phenomenology and semiology. But I find this coincidence where you do that through material and structural logics you anyway have to bring into the game, not to hide these and then create a kind of wallpaper. You go straight with and give identity and character and differentiation with those engineering logics. And that's a new stage, very much more mature stage of parametricism, which ties back, and that's why we had rediscovered some of the figures like Gaudi, who had certain geometric rigors, construction rigors, or Frei Otto at play. And we at Zaha Hadid Architects, this is some of our new range of work, we are also going down this route. I mean, we have to deliver a large project at the same time, but we also have a series of research projects and one of 2 or 3 larger projects which has been informed by these new kind of rigors, which have that kind of double advantage of being much more rich and formally diverse than what we had previously. I mean, this is the older paradigm where we just had these kind of knob surface modeling. But of course, this is still something I very much like. It shows that idea of parametric variation of genotype-phenotype conditions and 2 systems interlocking. And there's also a certain structural logic, always 3 points of contact and cantilevers. But otherwise, the form is much more free form and less constrained, therefore perhaps less character. This is also a project out of this earlier range where you just, it's very powerful. You can use those forms to pour into different corners of a site. You can integrate landscape. You can pick up various entry points and multiple levels. So it shows the versatility and fertility of creating, of having the degrees of freedom to create very, very complex situations and make a coherent, unified urban figure which you can navigate and has a certain logic and law you can follow through. And it's actually very complex and intricate, but at the same time quite calming and legible and easygoing on the eye in that urban chaos of Seoul, for instance. And you move from the outside to the inside, and there's a series of different conditions there. And the same as, let's say, the Beijing project is maybe a kind of blob-based architecture, single surfaces. And it works with curvature, is very important. If you have new degrees of complexity where you have multiple volumes, instead of letting these be boxes and cornered ramps and angled, let's say, trajectories, the smoothness of trajectory helps you to maintain continuity and legibility. The convex concave gives you a much clearer sense of units of interaction, of what belongs together, and you have a continuity also of logic and language from inside to outside and back inside. So I'm discussing this in ways which are, you're not talking about just a formal repertoire, but the instrumentality of a coherent language like that. We moved then ourselves to morphologies which demanded a bit more constraint and rigor. For instance, once we work with tensile structures, you get into more rigorous and stronger identity of the figures. This is a tensile structure versus a shell structure. They become quite distinct. Of course, there's still lots of degrees of freedom. You can do many things with them, but they gain more character, and that's what we like about it. Then we come on with patterns. They're embedded and they're scripted out of and have to do with logic. Structural logics here is primarily stress patterns. And we started this with experimental smaller projects. So this is showing through various layered ribbing the primary and secondary stress patterns and make them then give character and ornament and articulation. It also shows you where these lines funnel to the let's say support points and so on, and the thing becomes a more intricate and characterful entity. And also the stadium is coming out of this research scaling up where we have a shell structure which becomes a skeletal shell. By the way, we've worked a lot on skeletons, and structural skeletons give character to our towers rather than just an arbitrary shape and curtain wall. You get the kind of gradient of from heavy to lighter structure, so this topic of skeletal. So we have a skeletal shell, we have then tensile segments filling these elements, and you get an overall sense as an organic unity and characterfulness in a figure like this, which is different from just another blob or another NURB surface. And that's the progress we've made, and you can see it's a double progress. It's at the same time, of course, much more efficient. There's an achievement of lightness, of structural efficiency. In the end, of economy and character, they become congenial efforts. And of course, in DRL, and we're doing this, and we look back at pioneers like Otto, and this is the studio I taught with Mark Fons and the GSD. This was our proposal for Google Campus, for instance, and looking back at the work of Otto again, and you can see that the different systems, they're of a language overall. All that is parametricism, all is about continuous, about differentiation and correlation of subsystems and multiple systems, but they're much more characterful and different. Or when we come to environmental issues, or here the coincidence of structural and environmental issues, this tower isn't an arbitrary form. It shows the atrium and navigation. It shows some of the program, and it's a shading element. So as you go around, this closes and opens and represents, in a sense, the sky orientations in the building. And we do the similar here. Is all these courtyards are oriented to to capture the wind. They're staggered in height. They represent the sun direction. When we then put on the photovoltaic, they're in a certain direction. So these laws, which are driven from engineering logic, they also give coherency, navigability, orientation capacity to this work, which I think is very important in terms of the social functionality, navigability, orientability of this. Because the lawfulness and rule-based development of these projects means that if something is generated through rules, you can also infer back from the rules, so you have inference potential from this. And again, a strong character of these buildings. These kind of very closed volumes, and then courtyard conditions, etc. And I want to briefly show this, what I mean that the artistic, inverted commas, or the compositional projects, formal articulation project is instrumental, and the formal stance or compositional stance is not something which you do against a pragmatic stance. They in the end coincide and one facilitates the other. Although temporarily you pull back, I agree, in formal research you can't do everything at the same time, but a mature project, the compositional resolution and formal resolution delivers the project in terms of its social functionality. So this is a park and ride scheme. So there's, in fact, 2 car parks, a tram station, a bus station, in the park and ride. And you can imagine that this easily could have been just more of this stuff, right? Totally disarticulate set of patches of car park, bus station, tram. You could totally lose the whole connection, the integration. This would disappear in this usual suburban identityless spill. And what this delivers, but all the elements here are perfectly viable and functional, but they're brought under ruthless formalism to gesture the various continuity, what belongs together, the units of interactions. So for instance, there are 2 pieces of car park. We just thrusting them in one with this curvature helps to thrust us across the street. So it's even cut up by 2 streets. But it's a very strong unity. Inlaying this concrete helps, of course, in this through the street, doesn't disturb the usability of the street at all, and pull this together with this roof as one huge concrete thing, which brings you into the tram station. And then these 2 cuts from the tram and the bus articulates this. And it becomes a graphic approach, a ruthlessly formalist approach, but all the elements are just all the elements you need. They just become a palette of a compositional thing, but they're totally functional in the end. So, for instance, all these the demarcation lines work together with the lampposts to create this field, so you formally affiliate. These lampposts keep growing and draw you up closer. Then these become columns as they reach the height, and these demarcations continue as lighting slots and lights, etc. So that's the approach. You can just have that double, again, set of constraints. All of these things are 100% functional as pragmatic elements, but if you let engineers do it, that it becomes a disaggregate jumble of stuff like a backyard. So we can bring all these necessary elements into ruthless formalism and compositional regime for the sake of orientation, navigation, making it as an easy to find and pleasurable, elegant experience, totally for the sake of function. That's social functionality through phenomenology and semiology. It's a project. And what I'm saying, maybe just a few more words, that what we should look at our core competencies to give that built environment, to make that matrix of ordering a social process, like ordering that park and ride scheme through a set of reference lines which guide us. So I'm not talking about architecture as shelter in terms of keeping the rain out or even making it physically performing, that the roof doesn't fall in. That's engineering business, right? Although we super closely work with engineers, in the end we also know that we aren't engineers. And I'm telling this to Achim and Mark and all these guys who talk too much about engineering and never enough about the architectural project and the compositional project. But this is the kind of things which architecture does. It's a text which structures all our communication patterns. They become ever more dense and complex. And you don't need to think of them as physical shelters. You just think of them as guiding structures, thresholds, lines, And this has always been like this. And you always needed a graphic overlay to articulate the complexity of, and increasing complexity of social structures. This is about ordering social processes of status group types, organizations, institutions, and their patterning. And that's the difference between this flock of apes and the human society, that it can grow and become larger, and it grows with its built environment, and creating status group and structures and institutional patterns and rules of interaction which change when you go from one setting to another. The rules of interaction change, and that's why we are always coordinated and put on the same page through that semiologically encoded and designated set of institutional regimes which are plotted out like a text in the landscape, and that becomes the project we're actually working on. And we need to realize this, and that's why we need all that spatial graphics for. It's like a board of chess, you know. A certain structured process can only take place with the built environment, designed as such under the compositional stance. And it is, of course, not in the individual elements, it's in the systems of similitudes and difference. So it's the semiological logic, the grammar, which matters. These have the same grammar, if you like. And we need to reflect this, and that's why I made the semiological project a key project. It's in my writings, laying out the axiomatics, and I want to work on it. This goes not on all scales. This is all design elements, including fashion, the fashion system. You saw all these tribes decorating themselves funny. That's not for fun. This is a life necessity. Otherwise, at the edge of poverty, why would you spend so much energy and time and effort in this? It's a structuring device. And so I've also of Ross Lovecraft and industrial design and urbanism in the book as well. All these design disciplines fall into the same categories. And I just wanted to end on indicating, one of the articles talks about this, that social ordering process through spaces, which might at the same time also become active and interactive, but could also be static, is something we could maybe start working on more explicitly if we bring the social meaning, maybe the social processes, into the model, and we start looking at what these forms might mean, could mean, particularly if we're more inventive about, and we're escaping from stereotypes where it's trivial what things are and you can just write labels and it's obvious. If we become more open-ended and more explorative with this, all the more we need to explore the utilization and structuring and ordering capacities of these elements, spaces, ceilings, and what they might mean. And so that becomes the agent-based parametric semiology project, which I'm pushing and trying to now develop the next stage through a series of researches, which I've done with Duel and elsewhere, but I'm now doing it with a kind of set of maybe more professional research setting, by the way. I don't want to say much more, but here you can see that there is the parametricism, the whole richness of the vocabulary, the openness, the permeability, the differentiation and diversity. In the end, was brought home what it means. It means that we have this kind of intricate multi-audience, multi-status group, differentiated audiences in a kind of rhythm and choreographed and self-organizing set of interaction processes, which is what contemporary life is now like, in 24/7 network society, in the center where it all comes together. That's the end game, I think, what all this means and should mean. That's my proposition. And it's curiously that a lot of the features which we've been working on, whether it's curvilinearity, whether it's gradients, whether it's open permeability, continuous differential field conditions, are the kind of conditions which I find relevant, for instance, in corporate interiors and in university campuses, in mixed-use urban intense cultural centers and so on. These forms and repertoires make sense. Of course, when we initially just experimented with them as dry runs, it wasn't becoming clear. They were just there stimulating challenges, but I want to push that to a point where they become really global best practice and compelling superior high performance environments, and I want to demonstrate it with what I call extended life process modeling as an agenda. And so that's the way I think all the aspects of architecture fit in. I'm also with Zaha Hadid Architects, I'm trying to push this. There should be program innovation. There should be continued formal innovation, formal research. So that I like here what's going on, even the visual, I think what I call it, visual studies. This is wonderful and necessary, but we need to know what it ties into, how to instrumentalize it down the line. And when we are facing all these new conditions, large projects, urban projects, we continuously need we need to be fed new repertoires, new forms, new formal structures we can experiment with. But I have that ambition and make that leadership claim to the discipline that these things have to come together and become compelling global best practice, mainstream deliverances, and can't be just kind of left in the limbo of an avant-garde condition, or like Jeff would say, a kind of what's it called, a kind of idiosyncratic and self-marginalizing demimonde. We need to claim center ground. We need to say the built environment globally needs to be transformed in the image of these potentials. Like, if you look at 1965, the planet was a totally different planet. Everything was modernism, everything was Bauhaus, urbanism, whole cities, Brasilia, every building, every space within the building, interiors, furniture, everything, every product. And I find it staggering and fascinating when I imagine Korb, Gropius, and Mies meeting as young men in Behrens' office where the world looked different. And then in 65, they're still around and look at everything has been transformed in the image of what they created. And I find it what I want. Thanks.
Okay, well, anyway, I just have also a quick little kind of intro thing here. Like Hernan, I was trying to think of who if there was a duel or a duet, who would the characters be? And I keep coming back around to Leonidas and Xerxes I. And not that it's clear necessarily which one of us is which. Leonidas, you guys know the story. The Battle of Thermopylae, where Spartans, city-state, along with other city-states, go and try to defend a very tight passage as the Persian army, which was recorded as 1 million Persians, the invading army, tried to make it through. It turns out it's only about 150,000 Persians that actually made it in boats over. But what was so interesting is that Leonidas, knowing that he was basically beat, he lays out his last 300 troops at this small juncture. So, and of course, they were all killed. Xerxes won. But eventually, Xerxes went too far into Europe and found out that he, well, actually, I think a lot of his troops died from disease and other things, and he had to retreat back to Persia. So, anyway, Leonidas is an interesting character because he's a Spartan king, but he's a kind of idealist, whereas Xerxes is a kind of realist. And I thought, like Hernan, that this is one of the creepiest scenes of the movie, if anybody has seen it. I thought this would be a better model for tonight and not the other one. And again, who's who? I don't know. They both look great. One has high performance abs, and the other one is just looks great. So either way, I just want to quickly, as a point counterpoint, I guess I would say a couple of things. First is that I actually I find I have quite a lot in common with Patrik in terms of his core values of architecture. Hernan mentioned that a second ago, and I find that that's very true when I read what you write. I believe very, very strongly in the separation of architecture and from other disciplines, and in the expertise that we need to have as architects, and in the pride, frankly, that we need to have as architects. And that I think right now there is a lot of concentration out in the world, and even within our discipline, on issues which I consider to be extra-disciplinary, including humanitarian issues and other kinds of social issues that we can attempt to connect with, we can attempt to solve, but I don't really think that that's what we're very good at, and I don't think that the successes of architecture are usually in those realms. So anyway, I want to just I want to talk about, since maybe everyone's read the Parametricism 2.0 book, I don't know. I have it. I know a few things from it, but I haven't read it all. But I want to lay out just a couple of points, some of which will be will be counterpoints to what Patrik is arguing for, and some of which I think will align with him. So the first thing that I think that architecture needs to do is, and I think it's absolutely crucial, is that it needs to, and this is comes from discussions with my friend Todd Gannon, who's not here. It needs to advance the public imagination. I think that's absolutely crucial for architecture to do. I think that it can solve problems, and it should, but I don't think that that's the primary directive of architecture. And I think that I like the word mystery very much, because it basically, epistemologically speaking, it says that we can't really know everything in the world. We're not science. Science attempts to know all things in the world or break things down into small pieces that can be known. I think that architecture is at its best when it's producing something that's alien, that cannot fully be consumed. And so I'm very, very much interested in that kind of architecture that can never be fully consumed. And so these pictures, this is an actual, real diamond mine here in Russia. Is it real? Is it not? We don't know. Is it natural? Certainly. Is it a model? We don't know. And the orca on the left, very interesting. Is it a toy? Is it a predator? Is it a killing machine? All of which to say that I think that this is where architecture can be very, very successful. And when I look back at the modern project for a second and think about the City for 3 Million from Le Corbusier, it's very interesting to see how grand unified theories, which is generally a term that we hear in the sciences, but I do think I hear it a lot in what Patrik's saying, and I think that grand unified theories are certainly not new to architecture, and we talk about the meta project very often in architecture. Eisenman gave a great lecture on that some years ago, and I think that it's both invigorating and it can well organize a lot of disparate practices. But it also can have downfalls where things become generalized very quickly. For instance, I look a lot at Le Corbusier, and I think it's very interesting that from the same author you get City for 3 Million, which is both a really important modern attempt to clean up the 19th century city, deal with light, air, and infrastructure. But on the other hand, it negatively impacts, as we know, moving forward. It creates untenable density situations, and also total functional segregation. So, and that was a project that wasn't his primary project, I would say. I'd say that's picked up more in the international style and sort of, CIAM and other people. But I would say at the end of the day that his attempts towards a new architecture, to lay out standards for architecture, his 5 points of architecture, all of those kind of standards that he laid out, ended up, in my opinion, not being as important for his oeuvre as the extremely tightly authored works, as Firminy, this project, which which was recently completed, which doesn't follow any of his own rules, and certainly is not a really great example of an international style architecture. And I think that that's really, really important. I think that this kind of work is not just an anomaly, but that anomalies actually push the discourse further. So architecture, my argument would be that architecture is at its best when it projects alternate realities and doesn't just mirror or instrumentalize known social systems. Okay. So maybe there are two kinds of, I heard recently there are two kinds of people. There are guests and there are hosts. I don't know if that's true, but maybe there's two kinds of architecture. There are conduits and terminals. I'm working right now on terminals, things that have boundaries that are distinct, deferrals of interiority, things that have depth and that are inexhaustible, as opposed to conduits which which can conduit architecture, which can easily reify flows or other kinds of systems of movement or interconnectivity in designed and built form. This is a project for Helsinki from last summer or the summer before last, I forget, the Guggenheim Helsinki, where the idea was to create an object which would not be intelligible necessarily as an icon. It wouldn't necessarily be inviting in the conventional sense of having apertures and green space and all of those kinds of things, but that it would be mysterious and it would be intelligible, or not. It would not be intelligible and it would not be immediately consumable, but it would grow on you and it would have durability to it. So on the interior, there's also a desire here to create multiple grounds on different levels, create a kind of vastness on the interior where the galleries can either be inside the nested object or around the perimeter of the piece. And then you're constantly hopping between two types of galleries, one on the left, which is daylit on the outside in the poché space, and one which is on the inner object, which is completely artificially lit, which are two kinds of spaces that contemporary museums like to have. So parts versus flows toward a flat ontology of architecture. This is something I've talked about before many times, actually. The picture on the left, as many of you know, as the epigenetic landscape from Conrad Waddington, but I know it more from Sanford Quinter's article from when I was an undergrad called Landscapes of Change. And this was a time in architecture in the early 90s when we were talking a lot about so-called intensive forces. This was coming from Gilles Deleuze. And the intensive forces are in fact these guy wires or these puppeteering wires that are driving the surface form from below. So the extensive reality above that is not prioritized. Rather, the intensive forces or the unseen forces flowing around below are prioritized. And I think more and more, and associated with that would be the werewolf, which was a big Deleuzian analogy at the time, this sort of half man, half wolf, and all the things in between, constantly referring back to otherness and sort of human psychoanalysis. Whereas on the other side, if you think about the specificity of objects, and I think this is probably horrifying for you, Patrik, to look at that. But I think I'm very, very much interested in the way that maximizing difference between things and almost unique entities, almost things that are like living entities, can create the most diversity through difference in kind rather than difference in degree. Meaning totally different things rather than things that have a kind of, let's call it continuous variability. So that would be difference in degree. These are some projects, the way that we kind of collect them in the office. I realize I'm kind of a hoarder in that way. So what do I mean by flat ontology? It's not that clear. It's a philosophical term. I'm borrowing it from philosophy. It basically means that what is ontology? It means how it's a study of being. How do things exist? How do groups of things exist? And I think it's a deep architectural subject matter that we all deal with. I think that you have an ontology, Patrik, as well. I like the idea of a flat ontology, that we can begin to pull apart things that I think are fundamental issues for architecture. In this case, this is just one example, but I could draw it differently. Mass, interiority, tectonic articulation, ground, and beginning to think of those things not in an automatic hierarchy where mass begets interior, and then mass is then articulated tectonically, but that those things could actually be put on a horizontal plane side by side and begin to interface with one another as separate entities rather than as a giant kind of hierarchical or system and subsystem in that way. So you know, I'm interested in the back and forth between total alignment of things and loose fit or misfit of things. So one example might be between mass and interior, where there might be there might be a clear relation between interior and exterior. But generally in my work, I'm trying to get much more difference, much more loose fit and misfit. So this can be applied to the relationship of a mass to the ground, how it hits the ground. So is it conforming and aligning with the ground, or is it misfitting or loose fitting with the ground? Or mass to surface articulation? Is there a visual, clear visual relationship between the way that you articulate a mass, or is there a kind of crossing of different systems across one another in order to create tension and independence of things? Here's a house called the Griffith Park House, made out of parts, very, very simple, low-res parts that and joints that come out of dealing with parts rather than the whole. Extremely deep joints, 5 feet deep joints, so that you can begin to feel the piece disaggregating, but not to the point where it falls apart. So this is not a return to deconstructivism. The things you notice are also get tied back together or glued back together through other systems, graphic systems sometimes, and seams, which will tie things, even materials, which will tie parts back together again visually on the outside. And on the interior, it's not necessarily a series of discrete spaces, but it might in fact be that there's an interior that's more continuous. So those pieces are linked together. So there's a chunk coming off. Containers. I would say that if we were to compare the thinking in circles as opposed to thinking in lines, a circle always has an inside and an outside. It contains things, and it always creates enclosure, whereas a line kind of infers surface or endlessness. And so again, I would say I don't think that this is me versus Patrik at all, but I think that I'm definitely working on circles and mass more than lines and surface at this point. I also like the idea of containers, because when you say container, you are kind of inferring that it contains something. Like, otherwise you'd call it, I don't know, a hull or a box or something else. But a container contains things, and I think that's been crucial for a lot of my projects, is this idea of containing other things or other worlds or other objects inside of another object. This is an older project for a contemporary art museum where we were working with large chunky masses called jacks, and then putting them in an elastic outer enclosure, and then adding on top of that a loose fit layer of graphics, which actually there's a good example of it downstairs in the gallery, which aren't just graphics, they're embedded in the skin, and they begin to confuse which jacks are inside, which are pushed out from the inside or pushed in from the outside, and they create other kinds of visual effects, which ultimately are kind of vexing, where you don't fully understand, maybe from different times of day or points of view, exactly fully what you're dealing with. Ground, I'll just go really quickly through ground. I've been moving away, moving away from landscape projects and the confusion that oftentimes we see between landscape and architecture. It's part of what I consider to be a misunderstanding of nature. I love this. I always show this in my lectures. This screenshot from Google Earth where the plants themselves are crystallized. I think this is a better view of what contemporary nature is in the Anthropocene era, which is the era where man has begun to terraform, supposedly over the last 150 years, where man has terraformed the earth, and we understand that this is not a naturally occurring park, but that trees can be crystalline, and that nature is not natural. In terms of ground, in a lot of my projects, we work to create a continuous silhouette all the way from top to bottom around the project. I like to draw my hand around the thing to make sure that it's not merging with the ground. It's not confusing itself with landscape. In this case, there are a couple of deferrals here. One from the building and its interior liner, then a gap to what I was calling at the time, this was a few years ago, the ground object, and then the ground object itself not even attaching to the land, which is down below, so it begins to peel off at the edges. So it's pushed into the earth, it's not merging with the earth. Okay, tectonic fiction. So mesh, I really believe that architecture is too little developed in great detail in this era. I think that we, especially in academia, that we have been okay with dealing with concepts and massing, and I think it's one of architecture's core core capacities, to use your term, Patrik, is that you work it all the way down into the fine-grained scale, the micro scale, and deal with materials and tectonics. I think it's crucial. I'm uninterested in the mesh, in particular the way that the mesh has been misused, that computer meshes have been misunderstood as architectural subdivision patterns in the last 15 years. So I've been looking a lot at an alternate approach to that, which doesn't start with material limits, but actually starts somewhere completely else in terms of figuration and what I call tattoos. So obviously these are not human tattoos, and what a building tattoo is, I mean, it's just an analogy, but it's very helpful to me to begin to think how we can break up surfaces in ways that don't just relate back to tiny pieces of material that can be carried by a couple of guys on a site, which is actually what our entire Fortis building industry is built up around, the size of things that can be produced in industry, rolls of material, 1.5 meter widths of stainless sitting up in Finland where it's produced, and then panels that can be carried by 2 people on the construction site. So this is a project where the tattoos actually exceed also materials. So you have opaque surfaces that are getting, and we did this through reified reflections. This site is in fact an artificial light studio. It's not its actual site. And what I liked the most about this project, it's called Diamond City, was that the tattoos don't care much about where they are. They actually leap over materials and break as they go across, whether it's glass or opaque areas, or they don't know how to deal with a corner, or they sometimes align with a corner and other times deviate. Okay, supercomponents is something else that is related to that. When you start to break up things as almost as if they were toys or models, when you break them up at much larger scales than fine-grained panels, I start to think of things as supercomponents, which is a word I like also because super seems to mean above and component seems to mean below. So how can something be both very, very large and above in a hierarchy and also below? Looking at aircraft construction and other kinds of construction. Here's a prototype of 3 giant super components that we did for a Biennale, which key together in a friction fit kind of way, so almost without hardware, maybe with a little bit of structural adhesive or a pin, but it's based on Japanese woodworking and carpentry techniques where you try to avoid the use of mineral materials in favor of all wood, or in this case, all composite materials. So this is that piece that we delivered. And the materiality of this piece is a mystery because it's not made out of metal, but it appears to be metal in terms of its finish. Kinmen, this is a port terminal project that we did, a competition 2 years ago. I think what I want to say about it is that by taking these chunky parts and inserting them into an otherwise completely normative typology for a port terminal, which is 1,000 feet long, actually, we began to not only get extreme formal differentiation between the slab and the rotated jacks, which don't have a correct orientation. They're all different and scaled differently. So the point here wasn't to have total smoothness between the two, but to have something that was very quickly transitioning between the slab and these objects. And those things they aren't just sculptural, they become the core commercial function of the project, as well as offices at higher levels. And they also respond to the brief, which asks for the terminal to become a gateway. So here are the parts of the project coming together and the way that it breaks up the plan. One thing I'd like to say is in terms of the fine-grained quality of it, and this is something that I'm always vexed by, but 40% of the points given for this particular competition were based on your relationship to local context. So I sweated on that one for about 2 months, and then finally we realized it's so easy. We just go to Kinmen and see what's there and see if there's something that we can use in our own way. And so we found these maze-like structures in Fujian architecture. And I like the maze very much as opposed to the panel because it seems at first impossible. How can you do giant maze-like panels? But you can. You just have to have control of your joints and the scale of joints. And of course, also, these are proposed as maritime composite construction as well, so they are quite large. So they appeared maybe to be metal, but they're actually metallic finished composite materials. So there's that thing, which you could say is a minor effect, but I think it's really crucial to the work that we're doing. And maybe just really quickly, a tower in Williamsburg. This thing is, it's very tightly controlled in terms of the number of units, 390 units. A very big project, 600 feet tall. It's already given that there's a sky lobby, that there's retail, commercial, 2 towers. It's given that there are 2 different heights of towers and all of those things from the master plan. So our goal was to do as much as we could with a few formal moves and with these reified, in this case, reflections to create an alternate legibility of the thing, so that it could be read as 2 towers extruding from the ground, but also as towers almost signaling to one another and create alternate figuration. So we do that and then break it up into 2 facade types that are not compatible necessarily. They're just adjacent to one another. One of which is a much larger scale, a super scale, and the other one is a smaller, almost known scale, punch windows, which I've never done before, and it was we wanted to just try it out, see if it's possible. So this is the model, and you can see as you move around the object, you start to get strange and kind of unexpected figurations on the thing based on the 2 facade types. And finally, the museum, the main museum that I'm doing. This is a really interesting project with Tom Gilmore, who's the chairman of our board here at SCI-Arc, and these are it's inside. Well, it's underneath and inside and on top of these 4 buildings, right in downtown LA, 4th and Main. And 2 of those are historically preserved. So the museum, and this is called the Main Museum of Los Angeles Art. The museum is intended to be fully woven into the urban center. So this is not the Broad. It's not an iconic museum. It's very hidden and stuffed into the back corners and back alleyways of this building and on the rooftops. And it's also intended to be a kind of almost a pilot project for building on the rooftops of downtown LA as a new territory to build on, and even basements. It turns out there are tons of basements all over Los Angeles that aren't being used at all. So instead of having a surface idea of trying to connect all of the different spaces together with surfaces, we decided to go discrete. And so there are these discrete installations and moves that we make around the project. 9 of them, actually. So one, we wanted to give a kind of a bit of a fake out of this is the museum by putting a facade on there and giving a glimpse of what's on the rooftops, but in fact that remains a parking garage. It remains functional even during the construction of the museum. And then on the park side, towards Spring Street, we have a giant art video billboard, and which has a double layer, which acts as a pochette for walking from the park all the way up to the rooftop. Gallery space down below, about 40,000 square feet, which is completely normative. Spaces which connect up to 4 levels together. This is called the void, which gives you finally like some relief from some of the basement spaces, which go down to basements, sub-basements, and sub-basements from the 1950s, where they were protecting, I guess, valuables with lead doors and all of the above. So, and this is the restaurant, the museum restaurant in Farmers and Merchants, which also allows the museum to penetrate inside, so you're looking at people, looking at art, and they're looking at you, and you're in the museum restaurant. And the rooftop. And we're using composite materials for this. You can erect this thing in a very, very short amount of time because you can build it in giant integrated chunks, which is something I've been dreaming about for a long time, and we're going to do it on this project. It turns out you fly it down the LA River from the north, and you can fly across as long as there are city streets. You just get you get an entertainment permit like all the movies do, and you can drop these things on the roof. So this is one of the elements on the roof. It's a cafe And you see there's a new ground on the roof as well that's been established to hold large pieces of artwork. And it's a kind of a big event space. And this is the close-up of this is a missing jack and the tattoos which are aligning and misaligning with the object. So thank you very much. So, yeah. Yes. It's funny, Patrik, when I think I've lectured at Innsbruck, Vienna, the AA a couple of times with you in the audience, and I always have this memory that you look disturbed or irritated, and you have a different look today, but I've seen this look, and
No, I'm fascinated. I mean, I remember your A lectures was very strong, and what I appreciate most, or where we coincide a lot, is when you're developing a vocabulary to discuss compositional issues, let's say. And this has a long tradition within the field, but it's very, very few people are doing it, and I think it's worthwhile. And also these contrasts and the way you want to move from one condition to another, that's maybe I worry a little bit about this. Sometimes the left condition is maybe it shouldn't be discarded. Maybe it could coincide with the condition which comes on top. But I really appreciate that aspect, and you also had that in when you gave the A lecture. So I really like that. But my question is this. Can you defend this? I mean, is it only the stimulation? How does it become more than an artistic expression and a repertoire expansion without purpose?
Well, I would say okay, without purpose.
Somebody else.
I think that
with maybe a willful refusal, nearly of what you call. An easy consumption of the object. It wants to be kind of getting in the way nearly of being understood, of being well adapted to its function. It seems to me that that's where you're going with it, although I think a lot of the compositional themes which are in there could be instrumentalized, but I don't think you drive the projects like this. And so I have that question, and I have the question of the generalizability of this particular set of values you're promoting. Can you imagine a whole city being filled with these objects and with these kind of values?
Well,
or does it?
Maybe just to start with that one. I think that's a really. I mean, listen. The way I see it, it's at this juncture. I'm not sure that it's absolutely necessary that we have one unified generalizable project. I'm not convinced of that. I have a lot of respect for the way that you've been able to implement your project and the way that it connects us to practice issues and construction and building information modeling and performance and all of those things. But I don't think that the unified theory that you present is the only way that that's possible. Like, I don't think the projects that I'm showing, for instance, can't be delivered in a similar way. Just because I'm not using the rhetoric of some of those things doesn't mean that I'm not paying attention to it. Like,
but can you imagine a large district full of these? Could you handle this, or would that?
Well, I mean, honestly, I could say the same thing about the work from Zaha Hadid Architects. I mean.
No. I would say yes, I can handle this. I just want to hear it. If you want to handle this, is that going there, or is it meant to be unique objects within a contrasting with its surrounding?
I would not like a city full of those. Okay. Just as I would not like a city full of Zaha Hadid Architects buildings. I think that your work is the strongest when it is building by building, honestly. I guess one issue issue I've always thought was a weaker area of your parametric theory is the minute it hits the urban scale. When things they appear to get extremely homogeneous very quickly, and a little flag goes up in my head where I'm thinking we're losing information, we're losing issues of livability, density, and what you call differentiation, which seems to me like a building is a little taller or a little shorter in reaction to its neighbors.
I agree with it. By the way, I'm
yeah.
going to pick you up on this when you showed this image of the heterogeneity of all these objects and the specificity of the object. And and when you talked about difference in kind and you want radical difference, I'm with you on that as a starting point, not as the end game. And I would have the same self-criticism of some of the parametric urbanism projects, which also a while ago that we did them, that they lack that sense of intensity and underlying difference and heterogeneity or richness. So I accept that, but I don't accept the idea or find it problematic, because that's what the condition is now, that you have an agglomeration of difference, undigested, unworked through, just thrown at each other, or just juxtaposing difference, pure and simple. And that for me is just a starting point. My starting point is, how can I have ontologically very different? And for me, it's not a flat ontology what you're talking about. You're talking about radical different in kind. That means different subsystems where you have maybe, call them conceptual morphologies, where you have something which works with bundles of lines and strands versus blobs versus kind of carving operations. Very, very different starting points, let's say base primitives and ontologies. And I would like to create a composition or an integration, a multi-system complex out of this, but now have different ways of allowing these different species to resonate with each other, feed off each other, sort of the differentiation of one being driving the differentiation of the next, and then they start to interarticulate, and one can be derived from the other. Yet there's richness, which, and again I would add to this, why am I interested in this? It's not just I'm fascinated by this, because I believe that society is so deeply diverse with its different institutions, so that the urban components which come together are so radically distinct. So you have, on the one hand, you have various residential types. On the other hand, you have a public building, a museum, an art building, and then you have a hospital, and you have a school, and you have an infrastructure building. They are of radically distinct purpose, function, expanse, and that's what would be the starting point, which shouldn't be over homogenized, because then you lose that legibility. But I have what I don't see in your discourse is you reject instrumentality. So I wonder how far you go with this, and whether it's defensible.
I don't reject it entirely. That's not. I think what I would do, I would do it secretly. I would do it secretly. I don't want to foreground it. As in the work of Friado, for instance, where we know, even in Mannheim, which was one of the most inventive Friado structures because it was so differentiated, we still end up with a dome. We understand that there's a form language there that's familiar, and we kind of can guess that if we drape something upside down and turn it right side up, depending on how we hang the weights on it, we can kind of guess how it's going to turn out.
I don't think a large mixed-use urban project should be a single system project, and I think an urban district or city can't be a single system. And they're already so that's where I'm maybe what we share the sensibility. So I'm also rejecting that earlier stage of parametricism, which was single system, which was far too homogeneous, but it only has variation in within a system and not radically distinct. Subsystems and ontologies.
Are you still trying to design whole cities?
Well, not as a single author, by the way. So my new formula is multi-author, multi-system, market-based urban order. So it's I'm speculating about this as being multiple authors and entrepreneurially driven, But my scenario is that if the discipline would have a set of shared values and agendas, and that we know that we have to, in the end, have an integrally functioning urban agglomeration, because the city is one, the contemporary city has synergies, and there's a reason why we agglomerate in the city, because we want to be close to each other. The different offerings, institutions, distinct entrepreneurial offerings, they're next to each other for good reasons, because they want to connect with each other, cooperate, have to do with each other, relate to each other. And that's when an entrepreneur picks up a site and imagines what to do there. He looks at what else is there and creates a kind of synergetic, gathering synergies. And that needs to be expressed. That's different from, and I think that the contemporary, and that posits the task of articulating these resonances and degrees of belonging, and there of course also the hierarchical making clarification of the structure, what belongs more to what is subsidiary, what is primary, and from different perspectives. This is also what you have when you build your figure, but then you have the tattooing counteracting and the seaming slicing it up in another way. I like this too, which is I call as parametric figuration. This is another way to give
this is
productive.
Xerxes putting his hand on Leonidas' head.
Making productive ambiguity.
I knew that was going to happen.
But what I like about it, I instrumentalize it also. Why do we have this? Because we need to have multiple readings and multiple decompositions for different audience within the same artifact, but it shouldn't all collapse into visual chaos. It should be calibrated for specific purposes from this angle, this perspective. These three buildings appear as one unit because for this audience coming from this direction, they're using them together, and in a different day or a different audience, they can fall apart. So this discourse, which is for you just a formal discourse, for me is, which is for instance that refiguration, that re-seeing, now you see it, now you don't. I'm imagining this be part of a life process where these people should see it and these people don't need to see it. And they should see something else, because there's only so many things you can see if you're confronting a complex scene. So for me, that's the phenomenological project, highly instrumentalized with respect to social ordering processes.
Yeah, I understand that. I would just say
that's what's
that
lacking in your project. So you only have a partial project.
It's lacking, though, not by oversight, but lacking because I don't believe that as architects that we can control the way that our work is received by a particular audience over time. I think that you can try, but the times that we try to do it, I think, first of all, time is not on our side. In 15 years, the way that the work is received is without question always different than when you first opened the building, which is even different than when you designed it, which is between when you designed it and when you opened it is maybe even perceived differently. So I don't
maybe
believe
it's an overreach
in,
what I'm trying, but I think it's worth trying, because if it wasn't, for me that wouldn't be interesting enough, right? I wouldn't want to be in this field if it was just, I can do this and it's enigmatic. That's not, I'm more ambitious than that, and not to denigrate this, because I think your work is very intense and very stimulating, but I'm just putting it to you that, and to the audience, that it's a partial project which you yourself can't generalize, and it's only works maybe for a certain type of project, which always we were accused of. We can only do these special signature projects, these kind of art centers, where people will tolerate and nearly expect that enigmatic stimulation. Yeah. And I'm not saying I'm excluding that. I'm including this also, even within some corporate spaces. They want maybe a space for freewheeling brainstorming on an unscripted space. But you can't. It can't be the primary value. You can't, because it's ungeneralizable. That's our difference. We in Zaha also always, if you look at the early paintings, she wanted this to be generalizable. She doesn't want to say, I'm only doing a few things, and I'm gearing up only to these special art centers. That, because again, we are like the modernists. They wanted everything.
Okay,
and they did everything.
Hold on a second. So when I was an undergraduate, and I looked a lot at Zaha,
yeah.
a lot, and I don't know, when did you start working for her, by the way?
88.
88, yeah. So I was looking at your work too. This was in 92. So what I don't have the same read of it, and maybe it's not my place to say that, but I don't have the same read of it. You were there, but what I read was an author attempting to reinvigorate the mystery of architecture by going back to suprematist painting and completely turning representation on its head by going for extremely, almost impossible kinds of perspectives of the world, which were it was very much a formal project. And I don't know if at that moment, I'm just guessing, but at that moment, whether or not she thought that was generalizable as a social construct, I would be suspicious of that.
Well, look, the formal project is a very important sub-project which I've always defended, and when Jeff came out with formalism as a positive, I supported this. But Zaha wanted more. She had early paintings, the cityscapes, the planet repainted. Anyway, shall we open it to the to the audience?
We can do that. Yeah, sure.
I thought there was an interesting potentially unifying idea, which is how you would each address the model of the city of the captive globe. So Tom, on your side, the city of autonomous, discrete objects, each different from each other, and Patrik, on your side, the ultimate parametric manifestation of the grid, which produces infinite variability within a very versatile and overarching sort of systematic logic. I thought that somehow there's some resonance there for both of you.
I mean, I would just say that there have to be other models of having coherency. It can't just be it's either collage or it's slight differences in degree between things in a city. And I think that I don't know if you would agree with that.
And my formula for this is that the best way to start is with a collage and then overcome the collage, because these elements you bring into collage, they have still degrees of freedom, and now they start adapting towards each other. There are various tactics where, as I said, one differentiation of one is mirroring or scripted of the other, or you put a third system across both, like you let that tattoo run from the solid to the glass. It could still be slightly different, but there's continuities now from solid to glass through the tattooing.
Like non-literal.
Other things are just
connection.
geometric alignments, other morphological similitude. There are various ways of, and I'm always saying, give me any ensemble, and that's the way often when you come in with a project, there's already a series of fragments, and which belong to an institution which has grown over time. Now you bring in another element. We're not putting the fifth element. Now our intervention will forge a unity across these differences. And that would be the spirit. Why? Because if you do it at the fifth element, who knows that this is even where the institution begins, where it ends? The sense of, I call it, the audience is not confronted with a meaningful unit of interactions. It even starts with the Bauhaus, if you look at it there. If you put the Bauhaus, if it was context with other buildings, it has these different volumes, sizes, depths, buildings. You don't know what to expect, what belongs to what, whether this is one building, it falls apart already there. And my problem is that these things fall apart very quickly, and if you have, that's why I'm asking the question of generalizability. If you proliferate your objects, you want them to remain distinct and separate, you end up with what I call garbage spill. You end up with a garbage heap.
Yeah, there's a picture in here.
And
I got it. It's like,
which actually
I don't think so. But I don't think it has to be so extreme. I like
you would
where you're going.
Ways of composing the larger entity, where you have to re-hierarchize, and you will discover the need for curve.
I think that, okay, all right, hold on. That's another subject. So I want to come back to that for a second. But I think I liked what you were saying before, though, about things retaining their discreteness, but almost signaling to one another.
Yeah.
And that could be through material or pattern or another object or other things. And I completely agree with that. I don't know. I think that would be a good way to bridge over these sort of extremes, the polarities that we have of collage and then total fluidity, I guess, would be a word you might use. But wait, I want to say something about the curve. So if you do say a lot that you're interested in maximum differentiation of systems, but then you leave out the possibility that something might not be a curve. How do those two things?
No, I don't leave that out altogether. But I think that, and we have projects with hard edges, with facets, and I think they could be in the mix. But what I've discovered is that curvature has a series of advantages. I think it's easier to maintain legibility in the face of complexity. Trajectories you can follow through, which when you have lots of angles and edges, that continuity falls apart, so you can't follow the path anymore. There's a number of other things. When you have boxes, when you want to bring things together, you need to intersect maybe. If you intersect rectilinear volumes, the intersection zone, which might be of interest, is another rectangle. You don't know how it's generated. If you intersect two spheres, with different radius or ellipses, the intersection zone maintains information about the origin, and you can see the curve has much more information. A flatter radius means part of a larger element, and you can see how they intersect, and then they have the difference between an intersecting point and the two curves. So there's more, I call it information richness, there's more information capacity, inference capacity, so there is informational superiority when you build up a composition with curvilinear elements. That's why you have Venn diagrams usually, and doodling and bubble diagrams usually with curves, because you can maintain your own legibility of what you're building up if you build up complexity easier.
I think
that's
that
this is the kind of thing I have didactic little pieces of lecture where I demonstrate that. You can see I'm always driving towards instrumentality.
One of the interesting things about your project in Korea, I forget the name, Dongdaemun, is that I think it's almost illegible. It's so massive and heavy. It's just in terms of pure scale in a city, it's absolutely amazing. And if I try to think now about your parametric semiology, I don't know. It's not clear to me that its successes are there in terms of communicating to the public, meaning it's more successful as something that is so vast that it almost appears impossible in the cityscape. So I'm not sure what would a project like that be communicating?
I agree with that. I mean, that's why I used the example of the park and ride scheme where it's maybe clearer. And this one, what we did there is to try to unify something which could fall apart easily because of the complexity of the shape, and we're using these kind of funneling to draw you through the path. Each door has this kind of funneling, and we have the perforation hiding all the, let's say, undigestible clutter of windows, for instance. So, and emphasizing only primary entrances, and a major cut in the surface indicates a major entrance. So this is trying to reduce complexity and have clarity, boil it down to the essential features, elements, moves to get a handle on this thing. And that is very similar. And so we end up with a lot of detailing, we end up in the minimalist camp. It's a lot about suppression of unnecessary physical clutter like all of this, or if you have to have it, bring it under formalism, which also unifies these elements. All the different lights you might have just become a grid, a field, a ceiling, and implied visual elements. You need to reduce the complexity of the scene, but without and hiding a lot of things.
But what is that, Patrik? What is that building? In terms of your own argument.
It's not semiologically active. It only indicates all the elements which belong to this institution, and it ties into the garden, because there's the garden which belongs to with sunken
So
spaces.
sort of outer boundary connection of
And
functions.
this garden through the green pulling up. So it's trying to unify different features, gardens, sunken courtyards with the building and so on. But it has no further than that. It's of course alien and strange. And that's not something I like. It's seek. This is something which comes out of a new set of principles. It's like Mies van der Rohe, when he first put the Seagram's building on Park Avenue. It was that bizarre alien enigma.
Yeah.
Now it's recreated the whole city in its image, and people don't notice it even. That's what I want. Believe it or not, with my stuff. Because it means that I've changed the whole city.
But then it can't.
and
But
then
then it
the
can't.
things-
But then it can't be this anymore. This is
No, that's meant to be. That's.
okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I have a question
Yeah.
about this idea of generalizing, and really my question comes from if you stand in Hong Kong at the peak project location where it should be, and you look out, remember the images from the project. There's an amazing intensity and basically quantification of the landscape, clearly. And if you think that maybe now you may consider that we're in a post quantified world, and we will definitely be by 2020. We will be completely post-quantified. Now, at that moment we weren't, right? We didn't have the machine technology or the ability to quantify everything. In a very short period we will be able to, and it's, to me, it's very strange to think that project envisioned a world where when I look out now, I actually imagine that from a distance that your project was built, if that makes sense. Like when you look at a lot of the forms, it's not continuous and it's not integrated, but that city was built, that vision, it just wasn't built by one person. So I wonder what you would say about tomorrow, because parametricism in the past was about almost like Friedrich Kiesler, imagining endless, but it's no longer endless. We are going to be able to quantify prior to design within a matter of minutes or years.
Quantify. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean,
Every aspect of life, everything from how many people, the amount of materials, the time, the density of
well, I mean,
the atmosphere.
I have actually my own project of trying to, inverted commas, quantify, which is the social process through crowd modeling, but what I'm interested in there is not technical efficiencies. What I'm interested in actually, and with the architecture, I'm also interested in qualitative differences, and also the idea that one qualitative difference can morph into another, how to transition them, how many differences you can grasp initially when you approach a scene, and then when you start introducing sub-differentiations. Because if you can't, look, this is like chunking. If I give you my telephone number, I have to chunk it. Otherwise, we need to reflect the cognitive capacities. You can't put somebody in a scene and there are 5,000 things. We have to break it down into hierarchize and structure the scene. So I problematize that. And I think every designer, intuitively, that's what composing means. That's what's different from engineer. When you do your own drawing, you continuously find yourself in that drawing. You composing something, you make legible something. Of course, if it's 3 buildings in a row, then it's trivial. But we're beyond that. We're talking about an intense agglomeration of entities. And I want to problematize this as a phenomenological or cognitive capacity, perceptual decomposition problem, which we've always done as architects who compose. And then when we do this, we've laid out the diagrams, what needs to be next to what. When we then, the formal resolution of this, which is 95% of the work, right? Again, it must mean something. And I wanted to say that this is instrumental, and this is qualitative. It's not quantifiable easily, That's about the cognitive
But when
navigation
Patrick,
of the world.
Patrick, when you use these multi-agent systems like your Maya army, which I thought it was really funny when we were at Yale, you kept, I don't know if you realize this, but you were saying Maya army, but it sounds like my army, which that was very funny. But it seems like you're, and if I may be misunderstanding this, but it seems like you want to use them as proof of concept, that you can in fact imbue architecture with semiology that is legible, and that these agents will in fact see the things that you want them to see and react to it. Is that the point of the research?
The seeing part is not in the model, although this could be made through machine vision simulate, but it's not. The seeing part would be me and you looking at a rendering or model and finding it credible that these distinctions will be picked up. But then the agents are fed with these distinctions, and then when they move from one space to another, they switch behavioral code. The current crowds don't do that. The current crowds only avoid walls and draw towards an entrance and avoid each other. They're not realistic to simulate.
No, I mean, they look like ants running around in that thing. For now.
I mean, the engineering crowds, the crowds I'm
going.
trying to build, I'm trying to simulate all the patterns of occupation, all the way of gathering and communicating and roaming and browsing and talking in space. So to know what we're doing, and particularly if we have environments which are like yours, very, very strange, right? So you don't rely on, you can't rely on stereotypes. You can't tell your client what this means or should happen here. And that's where I'm coming in also, and you don't know what.
No, I don't know, but
how
also...
But you don't even know what you want to happen, because you don't think about what should happen. You are fetishizing to some extent and the objects and the compositional problems, and I'm saying this is an important sub-project of our field. But if our field and the leaders of our field, if that's what they would be preoccupied with, you can't bring the clients in, you can't talk to mayors about these issues, then
you can.
You can't.
And I have. you can and you do, and it's
I don't think that's
absolutely
true.
possible.
That's not credible.
I don't think that by putting agents in the building prove out any particular argument other than this thing, other than, I don't know, maybe a corridor is maybe a foot too narrow or something for a certain amount of people exiting out of a burning building. I mean, that I would understand entirely.
Well, that's existing. That's trivial, or not trivial, but important, but engineering business. But what our business is, we need to understand the building as a communication, and we need to see it as an invitation to audiences to gather and with a particular mood and mode of behavior.
I agree with you, Patrick.
So
I agree with you, but I just don't think that
that's all clients take care about. That's all society wants from us. They don't care about this beam or this floor pattern, or whether this is the particular backstage discourse we have, right? But your discourse is a backstage discourse, and that's all good, and we need the division of labor, and we can't talk about everything at the same time. We need to stage and face the development of the project, and a lot of this is backstage project, and it needs to be then, and there's technical backstage project talk, but then there is a front stage explanation and verification, and this backstage project has to tie in and feed into this and support this front stage, but you, at the moment, you yourself don't set yourself up of tying into this front edge. I don't think you do. You do it anyway, but you don't talk about it here. You don't say it should be, because you sell your project as enigmas, and that shows me that you like Jeff and Peter Eisenman. You're a formalist, and you want to shield your formalist research, and I understand why. You want to shield that from being burdened with these other
I don't want it to
demands.
I don't want it to start expressing familiar modes of performance. For instance, you mentioned expressing the way that structure needs to be. I don't want it to express that. It's not that it won't work structurally. It's that I don't think that it needs to express that. And also,
no, and by the way, this is a misunderstanding. I think, first of all, you should be worried more about the incredible gymnastics. Your forms, I think, are. That's why I think you're missing the boat here, because I think you have that the formal discourse which you have. You could still have it without being so outrageously off track with technological requirements, structural requirements. These buildings are incredibly heavy, and you know, I think that there's a fallacy there. There's a problem there. I think that's not disciplined enough. You don't lose any of the. I think you could still have an equally rich formalist discourse foisted onto a repertoire which has less technical irrationality. So I think you're really limiting this repertoire. Although I like the formalist emphasis, but I don't think it's good that it's so far away from technical rationality. They should be brought together.
Yeah, I
understand
that,
what I want to express with the structure and the final analysis, I don't want to express how the structure works. I want to use the morphology of structure, which it has for its own purposes, now to give identity and character to a space, and signal what I should expect and what should happen in the space. And I can do that if I show the huge beams. I know at least I'm in a large space, and I know and I can differentiate this space from another space with a different structure. So it's not about a didactics of structural expressionism. It is using structure to express social content. That's just a
But
nuance.
it also expresses structure and engineering.
But
and
nobody cares about this.
It looks like an architect who's interested in engineering.
I don't care about it. So for me, it's this: you use tattooing, and I accept tattooing as a semiological. I accept decoration. Decoration was always there, and I accept tattooing. But I'm saying, why don't you, instead of using an arbitrary tattooing, why don't you use the structural reticulation, which you need anyway, and let that do the tattooing? So it's a little bit like the fan vaults of the Gothic church. They could have covered them in white plaster and then to put a graphic on them. And I think it's maybe you doubling up, and maybe this speaks already enough. So but I also know that maybe I would then also treat structure ornamentally, but I'm doing it congenially with the elements, like architecture always done with brick courses, with brick patterns, with sills and sims and lintels and so on. They become decorative.
A friend of ours, Jesse Reiser, gave a lecture a couple of years ago, which I really enjoyed, and he talked about how he had spent, I think he said 15 years working on a similar problem. I mean, I remember when I was younger, he was calling it fineness, but in a more mature form, it was him trying to pull differentiation, architectural differentiation out of structure. And at that lecture, I was surprised. It was very charming. He said, no, I'm done with that now. I've tried. I can't pull enough architectural differentiation out of structure. I need to move past that, because structure has a lot of requirements that it needs to fulfill.
But we have such versatility and range of structural systems we could choose from, that the degrees of freedom remaining are sufficient to deliver the compositional stance. And there's a congeniality. I think there's a kind of congeniality with respect to the contemporary handling of structures, which is all about fine differentiation. And that gives the kind of gradients we're looking for instance, or the differentiation we're looking for. So the contemporary way of handling structure is to some extent congenial, but I also accept if I can't make it work, then I cover it and put the tattoos. But I should try at least, not, go.
Yeah.
I think the two projects that you guys have are fundamentally different. When I looked at, like anybody at Zaha's painting, she has a painterly technique of making everything look like the building. She has a style for the building, and the landscape is stylized so that it looks like the building. So it's a very specific concept about contextualism and making everything look like her style. So it's a stylistic problem. And it's a painterly project, what she has. So everything else has to look like the thing she does, and therefore it finds its place. And the thing she does, the architecture, is a brushstroke. And it is, I think, slightly simpler, formally, than I think your project is a sculptural project. It stands alone. It's not, doesn't need a background. It's a very different construction. You are constructing a view of a painting with simpler brushstrokes, and I think also this is also part of the success of the project. Not that it's easy, don't get me wrong, it's an incredibly difficult achievement. But when I went to Beijing and I saw for the first time the Big Five, I realized actually it's an easy project in the amount of materials. The systematicity of the project is really engineered to the point that it's simple. And you need a lot of them actually to create the vision. Whereas your project is quite more complex in terms of the structural, the sculptural quality. You do one, and you do it all around. Whereas you do multiples, you do them as a view. I think they're very different artistic practices, both of them. I have to tell you the truth. I have to say, I believe there is quite a bit of input from both practices in terms of, apart from the tools and the social and everything else, which I think we can do this, and you can kill him because you have a big practice. But at the end of the day, the point of departure is fundamentally different, and it's still a fundamental problem of expressing
But now we have
somebody's
to ask the
vision
next
of the
question.
world.
I agree with this. So
Okay.
can you qualify this? Is this for you just, he
I'm gonna
has
get in
this
trouble now.
practice? No, you have to. He has this practice, he has that practice. How could we qualify that? Which one can you, or do you have a third practice and everybody can have their own practice? Is that the way we look at the discipline? Is that viable? Or are we able to rank practices? And say there's with degrees of comprehensiveness, with degrees of ambition, with degrees of criteria which are taken up and taken on, or is there something which is here's only? I'm saying it, for instance, is quite. This is only a very partial set of ambitions. So come in. So these are two projects. How would you rank them?
I think,
Or you just refuse to
I
rank them?
think the practices are a very different timeline, meaning that Zaha's project really changed through time, through the practice of making and through your presence in the practice. And I think, and having 500 people working on that project, which is a personal project of a painting, becoming reality through all the hoops and problems of making that actually a common desire. It's actually an incredible achievement. It's just on a different timeline. And the achievement is actually larger because you want to do the whole picture. I mean, it's not a small one.
But let me point out a little bit more. I mean, this is also what the two of us are now saying and how we describe our projects. I don't think we're just 10 years ahead. I think your ambitions are of a different kind. So, and I want to say this because there has been this culture of discourse where it is too easy to say, okay, I have this project, you have that project, this person wants this project, and we're all happy that we all have our own projects. Now my question is that compatible with the task of the field, the discipline, to deliver the built environment for the 21st century, that we just have our own projects and we're just happy to point that out and we don't want to have ambition to generalize this. Let me do this, you do something else, I don't care what everybody else is doing. That's what I'm positing. I think there needs to be this culture of discourse. Now it's the meta-argument. Was the right kind of discursive culture in 1980 when there was a bankruptcy of modernism and we had an open and brainstorming requirement to find totally new ways, and there wasn't something that had matured. Everybody had an equal voice, and you had all the mavericks coming forward, saying something, doing something, promoting and proposing something, but that's the condition of a brainstorming session where everybody has a voice equally, and you don't immediately qualify because you want that. But I think we're 25 years later, and we've gone through deconstructivism, folding, and the early stages of parametricism into. So I think we need to switch gear of discourse. We have to be demanding of each other, and we need to say, rank these projects, and we need to. That's what I'm proposing. So.
Patrick, can I make a comment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll never impact.
I mean, this is too much. This is like going back to international style again. I mean, it's like when I did my undergrad, you couldn't talk about style, you couldn't talk about composition. I mean, there were rules about what you do, how close you were to Le Corbusier or not, or not even miss. I mean, so I say that so how far, this is like bringing back modernism. I mean, literally word by word. I mean, it's almost as if ranking offices. I mean, you would rank offices in Argentina to see how close you were to the 5 points of Le Corbusier. And so how far? I mean, there's still architects there that are teaching that way at the UBA, the School of Architecture. Modernism is not dead, it's still alive. So I don't know. I mean, I think that, thank God that we move away from that model. Thank God that we don't have to have such strict rules at teaching, within the academia. So I'm really concerned when I hear some of your words, because they remind me 20 years ago, my early education, which I completely, like it's the beginning of that. And this is much later than when modernism, started in Europe. I mean, we're talking about the widows of modernism in South America. So imagine how late, how long it was. And, postmodernism got rid of that and kind of open new grounds. And I think that we're still opening new grounds.
Well, let me come back to this. I mean, first of all, it's slightly different what I'm saying. I was saying, first of all, we have to rank the different directions these disciplines could be going. Is it neo-postmodernism? Is it neo-rationalism? Is it parametrism 2.0? And what are my criticisms and what are my, I share some of the criticisms you give me. The degree of homogeneity which we had, I don't want that. So I might say the direction is into more diversity and richness and intensity. But so that's the first thing, the kind of, I'm saying, which direction should we go? Or is each direction, or can the city go in all directions at the same time, or we don't care? I'm just doing my thing, I don't care. Now, where it is very similar, and I'm not talking yet about within a paradigm ranking the different protagonists. Well, I'm not even shy about this. I think we should not be shy about placing value and arguing for the pros and cons of a particular approach, achievement, proposition. And if we don't do that, then we in a sense saying that we are certainly not ready. With this attitude, we will never impact the built environment. It will continue as it's been going on. Whatever anybody is doing is a drop in the ocean. I'm saying after...
I agree with you, Patrik. I would also have a problem like Florencia in this idea of the hegemony of it. That the hegemony of that single, which is also a project, just because it's so expansive doesn't mean it ceases to be a project, or even a personal project, frankly. I just don't understand why there can't be space carved out for other projects. They could also be quite large. I'm not arguing for everybody having like 1 million personal projects.
Look, the way I come back to this, maybe there is specialization like for cultural iconic projects, and that's the reality also of what the star architects have been doing, and maybe you're aiming for that kind of niche contribution, but somebody needs to think about the overall, and that's where it's similar to the modernists. The modernists were also rejecting the personal project. Corbusier's project wasn't a personal project, it's an absurdity. Look at his writings. These guys wanted to make history and wanted to participate in the adventure of the modern civilized world, the industrial world. And they realized that what architecture has been doing for decades up to now, backtracked, resisted, not participated in the adventure of an industrial society, Patrik, which has been growing from the mid-19th century. I agree. I want to be like them. Yes, I do want to be like them. And if none of us has this ambition, that means after the collapse of modernism in 1980, when this was damp and bankrupt, and we had all these brainstorming, all these protagonists, we had the postmodernists, the deconstructivists, the folding, all these people, all this convergence, for nothing. We've achieved nothing. Now you're happy to go back to neo-rationalism, and it says that this discipline, all this writing, all these projects, all these schools, for the last 30 years, they have achieved zero. We have achieved absolutely nothing. That's what you're telling us, and that we should not do anything. We should now have impact. We are this kind of separate little irrelevant demi-mode. What goes on, and we have nothing to do with. We're not denting it, we're not impacting, zero impact. And I'm saying I'm not happy with that. I want the full impact.
I'm not either. I mean,
But
that's not where I'm going, Patrick.
I want to be like the modernists in terms of making the impact, but it's at the same time the paradigm is totally different.
I don't
It's
understand
so
why there
different
has to
from
be,
modernism.
Patrick, I don't know why there has to be a hegemonic formal project though. Why do you associate that? And it has to be a curve. Why do you associate that with the rest of your social, economic, and technological theory? Why do they have to be one and the same? That part I really don't understand.
Can I offer maybe a way of looking at what happened in architecture in terms of context? It feels to me that architecture managed to create different forms of context lately, in the past 20 years. Meaning that if before context was, I build next to this thing, and they look all the same, geographical proximity and sense familiarity in terms of style, which in a way, whatever the style is partially the project of Zaha. The original project of Zaha is a contextual project. She wants to change it all, but it's a contextual project. I think now we have larger radius of influences. Because of the formal quality of the projects, they need space, they need visibility, they have different orientability, they're larger, they're bigger, they're taller, they're seen in different ways. It seems like Zaha's work somehow is not anymore the painting of an object on a landscape and the landscape needs to be. It's multiple objects that somehow are linked in our frame of reference because we know them, we understand them, they're all white, they're all similar. We know them through global media, magazines. It's actually a different kind of context, and the painting is not need to be happen in a geographical proximity. It's actually a contextual, cultural proximity. And it feels to me that really we are used to this, and the project became a different context. It's not just so close to each other. Somehow the parametricism, though, still lives into the painting. And did not understand that the density might be larger right now, that you might not need a brushstroke next to each other to create the painting, but they can be further apart because the cultural context is closer.
Yes, to some extent. I mean, look, there's no example of this which I can point to. I mean, these are just fragments, these are drops in the ocean. I have a huge self-criticism of all the projects I present. Right, so you have to see. It's difficult. I mean, I'm trying to grasp what I'm trying to get at. I'm showing other people's work, what I validate, what I can see. There's a little bit of experiments of parametric urbanism in different stages, more homogeneous, less homogeneous, etc. So it's not there. I can't point to it, but I'm trying to point a direction and a set of values and a set of ambitions. Which needs to be a collective project. That's why I'm saying this is not my project. This is what I thought was the whole generation invested in. And you've asked why has this been defrayed? What's happened? And I'm trying to understand why this happened. And that has to do with the financial crisis, which also has to do with a number of other things that some people see it as a fashion, as something which we get bored with and do something else. Even somebody like Rem has this kind of attitude, you know. So it's not an easy debate, and I know that not many people want to have this kind of ambition or debate. But I think if I posited it, I want to see if anybody else can, you know, what is the alternative? I've just tried to indicate it. The alternative is that we all do our little thing and the world goes on without us. Yeah.
But what if the density actually increases, right? I mean, in my head, I think parametricism will become augmentation. I think that design without augmentation, artificial augmentation in 2020 will be inconceivable, especially on a large scale. I can't imagine any project that doesn't have data and even some component of design that's augmented at capacity that we don't even imagine.
I'm totally into this. I agree with you 100%. I'm into high density, urban agglomeration, augmentation, all of that. Yeah. There's somebody in the back.
Thank you for an amazing lecture. And I lived in Seoul, so I used the DDP in South Korea all the time, and I really liked it. I know how it used to look like, and I witnessed how one building can transform the location, like socioeconomically, to a really positive direction. So I wanted to ask this question even before I came to SCI-Arc. And the question is, when the building was getting built, because it was so complex and idiosyncratic, it took really long time, and the budget got bigger and bigger, right? So then the media was talking about it, and some people didn't like, some people really loved, and so how do you convince people or public that your design and building will work? And it's a huge success. People love it, and the building produces lots of income compared to first few years. So
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful experience to see how popular the building now is, and 2 million visitors in the first year. It's only the Louvre had more visitors and all the events which take place, the Fashion Week, Seoul Fashion Week,
Fashion
and
Week.
the various permanent institutions. No, but what I find interesting to reflect is that there was so much hostility when there was only the renderings, the image, because it was seen as to being alien, it was seen as to being non-Asian, nothing to do with Korea, nothing to do with this place. All the architects were anti it, and I thought but we were somehow convinced that it might have a chance to be accepted. And I find that interesting in terms of the difficulty of, and I'm promoting this. It's a good experience for allowing entrepreneurs or leaders or decision makers to take the risk of offering something and put a commitment. And I first encountered this when I saw an intervention like the crystal wrapping of the Reichstag, which seemed like an absurdity. A lot of people protested, and in the end, this became a kind of weeks and weeks and weeks of love fest in front of that building. And so I agree also with what you're saying. Some aspect of architecture is sometimes that stimulation of the unknown, the unusual. We all look for this kind of newness and stimulation, and this is part of our contemporary society. So I'm not rejecting this at all, except that aspect of it can't be generalized across the whole city. This is just every now and then there should be points of stimulation, and yet part of the success is that even though it's so strange initially and unseen, once you're there, I feel things make sense. You can find your way around. These places are meaningful. You can realize what this cantilever is doing because there's a kind of the park or the archaeology underneath. These forms and spaces, inside and outside relationship, make a lot of sense. So they have to be. We anticipated that they're well calibrated with respect to what's going on, and you feel that in the end. So I don't think it's the pure the enigma is a temporary condition, which then when you move and work and live in the building, the features reveal that they're calibrated towards what's going on. So to some extent, I mean, this is never a tight fit. I like this concept of a loose fit, it's never one-to-one, and there's always degrees of arbitrariness in every form. And you always need to start with something, and the initial start is always pretty arbitrary. But I think now the ethos is in terms of working and massaging and building in and allowing this thing to adapt to conditions, to boundary conditions, to functional conditions, to interior conditions, so that in the end things fall into place. So that's the lovely bit of, and the high capacity of parametricism, that we have these degrees of freedom and we allow to work this thing. It's only complete when all these burdens and additional trajectories and bridges, it can absorb so much, and yet is not a kind of clutter contraption, because it is able to absorb these things and work them into something according to rules. So that's my explanation of why this functions. It's not purely just the strangeness of it, which I think could also wear thin, but it is that the strangeness is it reveals its new life process.
Just thinking while you're talking that if I were to one-up you, Patrik, and say, now that you've taken, let's say, some early work in the 90s, I would say even specifically working on Greg's interest in topology, and turned that into a social project that has to do with like a topological social project almost.
Yeah.
I would say now maybe another level even up for you would be to start to, and I don't know if you're interested in this, but pull back on the hegemony idea and start to organize architects parametrically, or whatever you need to call it.
For instance,
but start to organize a community in a more in a way that's. I mean, this is a great event. I love it, but it's also like you showed up. You're presenting a project. We're here. We're going to do this thing, and it's also I could imagine other forms of organization. Where we, for instance, I don't know, you form a group of expert architects and confront a city. And not with something as dumb as an architectural design review board, but in other ways, and become more political, actively political.
Well, thanks. I mean, trying this, I see Zaha Hadid Architects now also as a platform for collaborations. I don't care only about the firm and its destiny. I'm caring about the whole discipline and what the built environment becomes. And I think that when you talk about the congeniality of these kind of new ideas we had, like the field condition, for instance, or the idea when it came out in the mid-90s, swarms. Remember Jeff's flock of floating elements, a shelf, like a flock, school of fish, the metaphor of school of fish. We had the same year without even talking. We had our V&A building was a kind of voxel cloud you move through. So small elements suddenly forming and creating three-dimensional fields. And I connect this to something else which came up in that period more and more, which is the Bürolandschaft, right? Where swarms of furniture, where offices start to open up the section. They wanted more connectivity, or using fields of grids of lights as surfaces, continuous surfaces. So this is sociologically important because office parks and office-scapes and Bürolandschaft, they started to look like these swarm formations. This didn't come from us. This was something but it matters to me because it shows this is not an artistic project, which is strange. This is high performance, the environments, the best and brightest and high productivity spaces, the most advanced, where they wanted to flatten their hierarchy, want to have participatory structures, want to have fluid team reconfiguration continuously and make the firm porous to outside fluctuations in and out. It's a bit like Facebook now, this one huge floor, or what Biaki and Thomas did for Google. For me, this is significant. What is Google? How they see the next campus? In the end, they use these kind of tensile, huge interior urbanism filled with floating platforms. This is precisely the kind of things which we're doing. I have my criticism of it. It's too isotropic. These lumps are too repeated. But it's precisely a confirmation, and it's very deep and profound, because if Google, these companies, these kind of high-tech clusters, if they're craving for our kind of architecture, that's the deep justification of this direction of architecture. And I had this intuition a long time ago, and somebody has to point this out, because that gives real force to what we're doing. And I think that's very, very, very important. And when and the technological elements are also of interest, that now that this gradient and differentiation is very, very much congenially aligned with structural differentiation, right? Rather than having endless repetition, you have and I like that Jesse was wrong to give that up. That was a profound, I think, step when we started first to have just the surfaces without any structuration, and then we had this kind of voxel clouds, and he said the space frame itself and the density differentiation of the cells, and I'm occupying this space frame, and then I'm going to drop an object into the space frame, and if I do the finite element, the presence of this object radiates through and announces itself like a wave rippling through the space frame. So you can find, you draw back, you pull along this, and you find the object which intensifies all the members towards us, or the whole, which lightens it across. This was incredibly profound, I think, advance in this. And the same I thought when I condoned it and you have given up in the meantime, I'm still on your mind where you said, what Rogers and Piano did in the Centre Pompidou with articulating all the, not only structure, but all the M&E ducts and the fibers and nervous system, electric cables, anything. You said, and you made that a formal project, you wanted to articulate that, and I like that. I mean, that's, if you can make instead of tattoos, they look like your tattoos, but they had for me, they had the additional advantage of being actually the capillaries, the heating, radiating, and that gives you maybe more truth-telling. This will tell already a story. Of course, you can't let the engineer put these pipes in. You have to over-determine them, bring them under the ruthless formalism, like I put all the demarcation lights of the car park, the lamp post, the columns, everything was brought under ruthless formalism. We can do that with structure, we can do that with M&E stuff. So I think it's an enhancement and an advance, because I think, again, I have to challenge you that you have to worry at one point, and let's say Gary's work has also, as an early contribution, has been wonderful, but it lacks that disciplining through technological prerogatives. I have already said, we're not engineers, the technological prerogatives are secondary, but the constraints we have to work with, and why not synergize on them?
I'm with you. I just don't know that things need to be expressed. For instance, you're like, I know you're working on a series of towers that have expressed exoskeletons, and I'm sorry, but there's no way you can tell me that those do not look that they don't look like structural expressionist towers. They do, because you've chosen to give structure primacy in that equation.
Why is that good? Because the structure is there anyway. The structure, I can use it to give identity to this particular tower, and I can also, the heavier beams at the bottom, the lighter at the top, the more triangulation at the bottom.
Yeah, you can do that. You can do that, or you can put the structure 3 feet back, and you can do a completely different project on the facade. I mean, you can do either one. Either one can work. I find that putting the thing on the outside, it's a form of idealism, and it's quite, as you say, it's quite difficult to control all of that, because if we're not, in fact, architect engineers, which you're arguing for yourself, then you need to be so top down on your engineer to tell them exactly what it is that you are in fact acting like an engineer.
It's much tougher.
So honestly, it sounds like a contradiction, I have to say.
It's much tougher, and I accept that I feel that the degrees of freedom left are sufficient to instrumentalize it for the semiological project or the articulatory project, the formal project. I can do the formal project with this stuff. So yes, if I can, but it's harder. I need to be more on top of these guys. I need to be more knowledgeable about this in principle.
Yeah, of course.
I need to have more tools available, and we're working now with all these topology optimization tools. It's a tougher call, but I think if I pull it off, it is better than the wallpaper approach. Better, in terms of, let's say, the efficacy, because I can use what I have anyway for expressive purposes. Okay, it's a tall order.
I don't think anyone would disagree with that. I don't think that. I think a lot of stuff doesn't survive the design and construction planning phase if it has absolutely no use. It's very difficult. Obviously, it just disappears at some point. We know this. So I think
your point is taken that this is potentially in contradiction, and if the expressiveness would suffer too much, hide it and put the new facade on. I'm not.
But that doesn't mean it's just
adverse.
Yeah.
But it's a good working hypothesis to try to use this.
I have absolutely no problem, by the way, with some level of integration. I mean, for instance, my interest in composites, and I know you're using these as well.
Well, exactly.
I think that's going to be huge.
When you've done this piece, which was cantilevering here, I thought you were on the track. You used that extra black tape, and you were kind of happy about the coincidence of ornament and structure.
Yeah, but you realized a lot of that was fake, right?
Yes, but you wanted to make it.
No, I didn't fake it out of not knowing. I faked it because it didn't look right when it was just following the engineering diagram on purpose. which is actually, I would even say that would be the birth of the tattoo, is saying, okay, so it's not enough to express the structural purpose of the thing, or the structural performance of the thing.
Well, because the thing didn't have yet anyway a good and well understood social purpose, which would have required the tattoo for social purposes. That's my end game. So the end game for me is that all the, like I showed these chessboard or the lines, the sport fields, the tattoo would be instrumental in guiding the social process. That's the end game. Now, can I get there right away? No. You see there's three things superimposed. There is the formal research, first having idea what lines, other things, pixels, swarms, gradients. Somebody has to come up with this to increase my capacity to deliver. Then I have additional burdening. I want to ideally use not a wallpaper graphic. I want to use the tessellations, the seams, the ribs. I want maybe even the cables. And then ultimately it has to fit a semiological grammar. So it's very, very tough. And I can't do it all at once. So that's why I accept formal research, pure formal research. I accept pure structural morphology research. And I accept a semiology project, which is maybe very, very primitive. We're studying, for instance, traffic signage or visual languages. So it's a multi-dimension, multi-burden project. So I have to dissociate some degrees of division of labor, and you're one of them. But somebody needs to, I think, that's my proposition, have a clear end game, how these things in the end align and deliver a project which is, and that's the dream, fully conversant. It gives exactly that beautiful, legible text of guides people, bifurcates them, gathers them, and the right people in the right places, coming together and seeing each other, many things. And at the same time, it's a super light footprint. The fenestration means energy-wise, the right light levels, and that becomes at the same time, these perforations of the window become also the guiding matrix, which I'm navigating by, etc., etc. It has so all of these things are coming together. Like that's the dream of the project. Do I get there in one shot? No.
Okay. So this, I guess, this will be the last question. We're going a little bit long.
I guess I have a question about is the project of parametricism, and anyway, the digital project. Did the desire for the style come too early in terms of the technology that would support it fully? And I'm wondering, maybe that's a completely different genesis of what happened in modernism, where probably there was much more ready technology to then fulfill that with a stylistic desire. And I'm wondering if the digital came much earlier than the realization, are we just simply tired of this?
Well, we shouldn't be thinking in terms of becoming tired.
But
how could you become tired if you know what you're doing? You know why people get
different.
tired? Because they don't know what it's for. They don't know what it's about. There's only a partial conception. They just think it's playing with forms. Now I want to play with different forms. I'm a child. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just toying around. That's so, that's unacceptable for me. I would leave the field if this was that, unambitious. So that's not the way to look at it. The way to look at it, even if it takes 50, it takes 30, 40, 50 years. So what's the problem, right? And maybe it's a multi-generational thing. It will continue. I don't know how long. Maybe there's another huge rupture in civilization, and then we have to throw this away, like we've thrown away most of modernism. But I think for instance, that's sort of the challenge. Yes, you got to at least see the limitation. Maybe you need a protective shield. That I said it again. You should be worried about the fact that your things are not light. That the tonnage of steel which you need for your things is excessive. I mean, in the real world, you get lumbered with this. I mean, we got people coming up, and when we looked at the aquatic center versus the velodrome, and they're looking at tonnage, and you nearly kind of put in a castigated for that's it's wrong, because you have to also talk about the positive social impact which you deliver with the tonnage, but you don't have that either. So you just create tonnage, and and you have this kind of demi-monde partial justification, but out in the real world, you know, our building, our roof was double the weight of the velodrome roof, and that's kind of unacceptable.
I mean, it's
Potentially. Well,
yeah.
And you wanted,
like,
but
you know,
but also it gets in the way. Look, if you, for instance, if you don't make it light-footed environmentally,
Patrick, I feel like
you
you're
have
playing. You know that
you have
game on the
30% of the budget in 40% of the budget in M&E systems. You have huge amounts of area in M&E systems. You have ceiling which are 2 meters, and if you want to cut across sections, they get in the way of connectivity. This, if you don't control this stuff, you actually can't do that permeability, that interactive field you want to. You gotta be conscious of this. You can't just compose, and in the end, you have your floors are like 3 meters thick.
Listen,
and then your nice
Patrick,
cross-sectional trajectory is killed.
I think it's.
I know it's a tough burden all at once, but
it is, and I feel like you're playing a little bit this game that you know, this gambling game in New York City with the nuts and the P, and you're moving your hands. 1 second it's a formal project, then the next one it's a social agenda, then the next one's technological and economic
need to start
project,
coming
and all.
Together.
And yeah, but you know, I would just say, you know, it's I take it as total optimism that you want to talk about these things, and I do too, and there are many of us that want to talk about these things. We want to get traction, obviously outside of academia, but with our practices, and I think I take it as a form of optimism. I just think there's also some megalomania mixed in there as well, which isn't necessarily helping your case.
It's a very long shot, but if none of us is aiming and nobody's aiming, then there will never be a shot.
Yeah, we have to aim.
Okay,
I'm with you. So.
I hate to be the party killer. Clearly, we're going to have you back, Patrick, and we're going to need to get you another sparring because this can go until 2 a.m.
Oh, it can.
And as I said at the introduction, Patrick is relentless. So there's no way that we can win this argument in one way or another. So I want to thank you both. And this has been actually quite a great way to start the summer. So probably we'll have Patrick around soon and we'll take it to the next round. Thank you both. Thank you everybody for coming.